Alright, today we're going to walk through the installation procedure for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit on the 2022 and newer, so the third generation Honda Grom. Before we get into the installation process, I'd like to review some of the kind of unique features of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator. So for the 2022 model year and newer Grom, so the third generation Grom, this is a brand new part for us. But like many Fender Eliminators from Vagabond, it is proudly made, designed, fabricated in the United States. From a single piece of CNC laser cut and then CNC formed 1/8 inch thick aluminum. We finish our parts in a UV resistant satin black powder coat, so it's very durable, slightly textured finish that will blend in with like the factory undertail plastics extremely well. As we kind of flip the Fender Eliminator upside down, you'll notice we actually fold in portions of our side flanges underneath and send the PEM studs through two sheets of the aluminum sheet metal. And what that does is, one, give the studs a very stiff foundation, because these two rear studs are the ones that go metal to metal all the way up to the OEM subframe. But what it also does is give this portion of the Fender Eliminator a completely gusseted, essentially brace, and so it's much stiffer than a standard Fender Eliminator that just has a single flange coming down off the top. Like most of our Fender Eliminators, they have accommodations for license plate bumpers to keep license plate vibration down. And because we use pressed in PEM studs, zinc plated hardware, there's not that much loose hardware, and it certainly makes installation generally much easier. And some of the kind of small details here, we do have an offset, but an offset pass through that will gusset, that will grommet to keep kind of road grime and any kind of water out of the tail section of your motorcycle. But you can see we actually kind of kick out these flanges at an angle, and the reason we do that is just to kind of blend in the motorcycle lines as best we can. So of note there, we start the design process for every Fender Eliminator with a laser scan of a actual motorcycle, make all of our CAD models from there. Usually we'll start with a 3D printed prototype to make sure that all of the clearances are dialed in, and make any kind of final changes before we move into, call it, hard parts or metal parts. And the whole purpose of that is that we have hopefully kind of high customer satisfaction but extremely high attention to detail. So that's kind of the main portion of the kit, but there's a fair amount of hardware that does come with it. Like we mentioned previously, there's two license plate bumpers, or two rubber bumpers, that will kind of isolate the license plate. There's a push-through zip tie mount and supplied zip tie to just kind of really tighten up the cable harness as it goes underneath the Fender Eliminator into the motorcycle. That's what that grommet is for. It's going to go in that kind of rectangular hole. For the 4 studs on the top of the Fender Eliminator, 2 are going to get plated steel split collars. Those are going to be our strong spacers, and then we're going to have 2 thick plastic washers that are also going to serve as spacers, and all this is just to kind of dial in the fit in that pocket on the underside of the Grom. And then it's all finished off by zinc plated K-locks, so conical lock washers are integrated into these nuts, and those are going to spin down on each of the 4 studs. As for tools you'll need for the installation, from a socket standpoint, you're going to need a 10 and an 8mm with a medium to short length extension is going to be very useful. You can use a power driver if you see fit, but it's not necessary. You're going to need a 14mm open-end wrench, pair of screwdrivers, both Phillips and a flathead, and then mini needle nose pliers or needle nose pliers, and some version of either flush cutters or dikes. So to kick off the installation process, we're going to start by pulling or removing the rider seat. So key in the left side of the frame, that should pull it off to the latch. You can set the seat aside. Next step is going to be to disconnect this. There's a 4 lead or a 4-pin connector on the left side or the shifter side of the motorcycle, and you're going to want to slide. The way to disconnect that is going to be to slide this kind of glossy rubber boot back over the kind of gets caught on that piece of heat shrink, but slide it rearward, and the release is actually under that boot, so you're going to want to push down on that tooth or that tab, and that'll release that 4-pin connector. Now you can leave that 4-pin harness or that kind of loom loose here. You don't need to start trying to pull it back any further because it really does kind of shoot out under here. And so the next step is going to be to take they're 10mm hex heads. This is what holds on your factory fender, and you can remove those one by one. And once that's off, the fender plastic, that under tray, is going to kind of sag a bit, and you can see them kind of lowering down. So it shouldn't, the fender's not going to fall right off, but at this point, it's going to start to pull on that harness. So get your bolts out of the way. Those are, you can set them aside, you're not going to reuse them. And at this point, the only thing kind of holding your fender on is that electrical harness. So you do kind of have to start to maneuver it, and at this point you do get a little bit of play in this whole subassembly. You can see there's a tooth here that's preventing this whole thing from, so don't push too hard because you could break that right off. But you really just have to fish this last piece of the electrical connector out, and you should be able to sneak it right under that tube without too much stress, and pop it right out. That was just one of the cargo rack hole covers, those little snap-in plastic parts that fell out, so not to worry there. Once you get your fender off to workbench of some kind, start by just taking your license plate off. You can absolutely reuse that. Every dealer, every motorcycle typically has slightly different hardware there, so you're just going to reuse that. Set it aside. Next step is going to be to break down the factory fender and harvest all the lights out of it. So flip it on over, and on the underside of the Fender Eliminator, or the fender, excuse me, there'll be one 10mm hex head bolt. Set that aside, and then there's going to be 4 Phillips head screws that you're going to want to remove as well. This hardware is not getting reused, but if you want to kind of reassemble the factory fender just in case you ever need to swap it back, so be it. Then that plastic kind of bottom shell is going to come off. We're going to take the wiring loom out, and there's this metal clip that's generally rather flexible, but you probably want to use a either a flathead or some other kind of prying instrument just to free this whole loom up. So that's just a metal tab, there's no hinge to it beyond it's kind of slowly yielding. So you kind of slide back the protective boot, and you can see our harness that we previously disconnected, and then a series of 4 total bullet connectors that are also going to need to be disconnected, and that's going to kind of free the turn signals to get removed. And so there's really no great way to release bullet connectors except kind of delicately, because you can really pull them hard by accident. I tend to use small needle nose and kind of work your way out and try to avoid pulling too hard when they do finally release. But disconnect the greens are obviously the grounds, and then the colors are the 2 hot power, the 12 volt for the lights themselves. So once you disconnect the bullet connectors, we can start dismantling the lights out of the fender. You can go through the extra step of taking this whole steel brace out of the fender or plastic shell, but all we really need to do is get to these 2 8mm hex head nuts, kind of that are a little bit buried down. So whether it's with an extension or a deep socket or whatever it may be, if you can reach them, you can just start there. This hardware we are going to reuse, so don't lose any of that. Once those two nuts come off, you can pull the entire harness out, and you're going to want to take that out with there's a spacer stack that we'll review, so you kind of just stick your finger there and pull them all out. But you'll take the light, there's a gasket that we're going to reuse, and the whole harness. So kind of gently work all that out. It'll make getting the turn signals out easier. Then you can kind of quickly review the stuff that came out. So each, kind of interestingly enough, Honda stacks two extra washers under these shoulder spacers for their turn signal, and that's usually something that kind of we would do here at Vagabond, just to tighten up that fit, because they're terribly loose typically. So they came kind of pre-tightened in this case. We are going to reuse most of this hardware, and we'll go over that in a bit. But essentially you'll have two of these black steel shoulder spacers, and on each one should be two washers, two silver washers. And so you'll end up with two nuts, two shoulder spacers, and then four kind of silver steel washers. So those you can set aside. We're going to reuse the majority of them. At this point, the last bit to remove are going to be the turn signals, and so that's going to be a 14mm open end wrench that you're just going to take to this big nut on the stud of the turn signal and loosen both of those, and try not to put too much force into the turn signal itself. You should be able to just spin them off with a hand once you get them a bit loose. So in this case, again, these are going to pull through, and we are not going to reuse this kind of steel clocking plate, but we are going to reuse the nut, so those can go to the side as well. At this point, the factory Fender component is done, and we can start assembling to the Fender Eliminator. Now, before we get too involved in actually assembling all the lights into the Fender Eliminator body, there's a little bit of work to do on this main harness, and the majority of that is related to this big boot and the grommet that we're gonna later use to kind of seal off that hole. And so this whole system is all gonna get kind of reused and work just about as well as the factory system, but you're gonna have to kind of slide. We're gonna invert this boot, so instead of the big end pointing, I guess, towards the 4-pin connector, it's gonna point back towards the license plate light. And you really can kind of work your way off over all the bullet connectors. Call it dry, or if you have, like, it could be anything. It could be Windex, it could be quick detailer, something that evaporates relatively quickly. Just give it a little shot in there, and I promise you it'll make this process much easier in terms of sliding over both connectors, because they get a little tacky. And so kind of help it through. Don't just yank on the electrical connectors. You can kind of push it through, and once you get it most of the way through, it will generally be much easier to get out. And so don't invert it and shove it back on yet, because we are the next step is going to be to work the grommet over it, and so we'll get there in a sec. So now at this point we can kind of start the Fender Eliminator assembly, starting with the license plate light, and I would recommend taking the grommet off. This is going to go and install right back into the Fender Eliminator body by essentially pushing the two kind of bosses on it into the holes that surround the central hole. And so since the plastic on the factory shell is a little thinner than our Fender Eliminator, it won't look perfect right off the bat. Once you tighten up that light, I assure you it'll look good. And you can kind of tell when you flip it over, you can kind of pick at it to get that shoulder to completely pop through. And you can kind of see it gets a little kind of twisted up, and it's pretty easy to get it looking straight, and then it's very easy once you actually put the light on there to get it to all square up. As we kind of alluded to previously, when you take apart the factory license plate stack, I've already separated these, but they kind of come like this from Honda, where they're using a double stack of washers and they may be kind of stuck together. You may have to kind of pop them apart. And if you use that double stack on our Fender Eliminator, because our wall thickness is meaningfully thicker, it will be too tight, and you could actually damage the factory light by trying to clamp that whole system together. So all you actually need in this scenario is one of the two silver washers, and that gives a very nice tight fit. Still gives some give through the grommet to actually take some vibration out of it. So at this point, you've got the kind of slightly modified OEM stacks. You've got the two 8mm lock nuts, or hex head lock nuts, that are going to get reused. And you can kind of just start by feeding the 4-pin connector and then all the bullet connectors through that big hole in the license plate flange for the Fender Eliminator. Obviously, that's going to go down. And what I would recommend is try to, before you send those two studs in, kind of flip yourself over and get your shoulder spacers to go back in. And it really does help to push back with the opposite finger, just so that you don't kind of push that grommet back out. And so get your two spacers, the shoulder spacer stacks installed. They should just stay put at that point. And then you can feed the rest of the license plate light through. And this is the appropriate time to kind of look at that grommet and say, okay, that top section is like not quite as straight as I want it, and then the rest of it will take care of itself when you tighten it up. So get the grommet looking good. This one looks pretty good. And then you can go ahead and flip it over and install those two 8mm lock nuts. And so this is a pretty small bolt, so if you have a power driver, be very mindful, because that's an easy way to just break it. And so in this case, I would recommend just using a regular old ratchet. And because of these spacers, they will bottom out, so you'll feel a noticeable change in tightness, and it will go hard. And this is just hand snug. You've got rubber at play, and you've got a lock nut here, so there's no reason to go Hercules on that one. And so once you're there, because you've still got kind of a long wiring loom, let's just get it out of the way and start feeding it through. And so this connector, you just kind of have to step it through. It should go through really easily, and then get the bullet connectors through as well. And we'll deal with that side in a little bit. At that point, we've got license plate light nice and snugged up, and we can move on to turn signals. So turn signals, like I mentioned, they're going to come out of the factory fender with that big steel clocking plate. We don't need that. We're going to clock off the straights on that stud. You can see there's kind of a cylindrical boss, and then they're clipped with two flats. And so the easiest way to know which is right and left is to kind of pretend you're looking at the motorcycle from the back, the hidden side, so that Phillips head bolt is always going to kind of point towards the ground. So in this case, the orange or kind of maybe brownish connector or lead is your left, and the baby blue one is your right. But generally it should be pretty self-explanatory. And because our Fender Eliminator has that matching cutout, there's not much you can do wrong in terms of you'll see it when it goes in, it kind of finds a home, and then there's no more rotation allowed, or at least very little. And at that point, you don't have to bother with trying to clock or spin on that stud your turn signals to some perfect angle. It's already baked into the design. And so same thing, that 14mm nut is going to spin down. Make sure that you are fully seated, so that you can try twist it and make sure that it is actually all the way in, and then put your 14mm open end back on it and tighten it up. So we'll do that real quick for the other side as well, and then we'll move on to probably the most fun part in terms of wiring loom management. So again, just make sure it's seated into that receiving feature, and you can kind of give it a jiggle to make sure there's probably like a degree or two of total misalignment possible, and then tighten it up. So at that point, worth the double check of what we got going on here. Lights are on, turn signals are on, or the license plate is on. And so we do have pretty short leads here that are coming off from the turn signals, and we do want to push them through. And you can start to see here what that extra little hole in the middle of the fender eliminator is for. And so at this point, you can do it later, you can do it now, but it's just this time as good as any. Take that push through zip tie mount that's supplied in our kit, and the zip tie, you can spin it after the fact, but the zip tie is going to kind of go this way. So if you take that flat and kind of align the opening with the direction of the turn signals, literally just push it in. And so that's actually now captured, so it can't fall out anymore. And you can see at this point we would be ready to take the supplied zip tie, and all you do if you kind of put that loop in correctly is line it up, slide your zip tie through, and right now we're not cinching it, but you can actually loop it. So that at the very end is where we're going to collect, tighten up, and then cinch it down so that wiring is no longer an issue under the bike. Okay, so once you're back kind of topside, here is, I guess, preparation for, this is probably the single hardest part of the installation, meaning we want to eventually get our grommet down this long wiring loom and into that hole, and that's going to kind of keep these wires from chafing on the edge of a metal pass through, but mostly also to keep like water and kind of anything from your rear tire that's kicking up from making its way under your seat. And so if we went with a huge grommet, it wouldn't actually do its job. So you kind of have to shove this connector that doesn't want to go through the middle of this grommet. And there's two ways to do it. One is you actually just stretch it, and the other one is you kind of let the grommet naturally invert itself. So roll it over, and it's definitely doable. It's not, the grommet is fine. You don't have to worry about the grommet ripping. So kind of just let it roll on over. And so once you get there, your grommet may kind of look twisted up, but it should pop back to normal. So you're going to want to work that grommet down, and the bullet connectors are now going to kind of flow downstream. And these actually shouldn't be that hard to feed through the grommet. Take your time, just kind of push on the clear plastic port. Don't actually try to yank too hard on the connector. So get those moving over, and if you've made it to this point with your sanity intact, you're on the home stretch realistically. So at that point you can feed the remaining cables through. Well, actually, I actually think the easiest way to do this is to leave them out for now, from my memory doing this before. So at this point it makes installing this grommet a little easier. So all you have to do is find the kind of right area of leverage and force that grommet in. So squish it in, and again, just like the license plate light, flip it over and make sure it isn't like caught. So you can kind of pick at it and get it nice and flush looking. Once it's in, now you can actually go and shove your connections through here. So potentially a bit early on the feeding the turn signals through, but you can also feed that grommet or force that grommet in with the whole bundle. Is probably just a little more frustrating. Okay, so while we're down here, all you really have to do is get all the looms kind of looking nice and aligned, because you're eventually going to squeeze them down and you want them not to be kind of all rolled over each other. We can do that kind of as a finishing step. So what we're going to do here is simply plug all the bullets back together. And so it's mostly just an issue of matching your colors. Again, you can do it by hand. I tend to just do it with mini needle nose. It's not a requirement. I'm sure you guys love bullet connectors just as much as I do. And then we are going to match up the actual positives. So that's important, so that you're turning the correct way. Okay. One more. And this is probably the funkiest part, as I mentioned. So at that point you can kind of see you've got an assembly that mostly is playing nice, and all we got to do now is slide that boot, the good old boot, back on. And again, if you want, or if you have it available, throw something that's going to make this part, this sliding over this big connector ever so slightly easier. I just happen to have Rapid Tack in front of me, but Windex works just great. It could be alcohol, just something that you don't want it to be on there forever. So something that's got some amount of evaporation to it. So in this case, remember, sliding the big end down, and that's going to cover up all that. And so at this point, that's what it's going to look like on the motorcycle side. So this is mostly just to protect things from kind of rubbing on it. This is right under the seat latch, so it's a good idea to kind of put it back on, but it's not actually like keeping like water or anything else out of it. So as I mentioned, now that that's all connected, the last step is going to be you want this to be, because the space for these turn signal connectors is like at a premium in here, so you're going to want to make sure they're not twisted up, they're nice and tight. I mean, obviously you don't want like a whole bunch of tension in those for the life of your motorcycle, but you do want to kind of cinch it up so that you're happy with how it looks, even though hopefully no one will really see it. And then tighten the zip tie that we supply using a pair of flush cutters. Trim it, and then quite literally we're done. So at this point we're ready to put it back on the motorcycle. But before we actually do go back to the motorcycle, it's worthwhile to prep the fender eliminator and take the two of the V2 split the steel collars, and those go on the kind of narrowly spaced pair of studs at the kind of more license plate light side of the fender eliminator, and then the two black plastic washers. Those are going to go on the front pair, and all it's really going to do is allow everything to make appropriate contact on the back, on the pocket of the Grom, which kind of has like a little staircase feature to it. And so this is going to make it fit up really nicely. Now there's one extra thing we have to do to the factory undertail before we put our fender eliminator on, and you can tell there's a through the top side of the motorcycle there's a cable loom that uses a retainer that pushes through, and since we want to get our fender eliminator all the way up as high as we can, we're going to release this. And so you can do it with your fingers or needle nose, and it's okay. That's just it just needs to come up, so it's not gonna keep its retention, but there's really nothing to fear in terms of like that cable harness getting loose up there. So release that, and then we can actually put the fender eliminator on. So you can see from the top side, this is the little gray clip is the one we just released. So as long as it stays over on that same cable run, it doesn't get pinched as we tighten everything back up. That clip is not necessarily doing a whole lot. And so bring your fender eliminator over to the motorcycle, bring at least one of the nuts so you can kind of hang or let it rest while you get everything else situated. And all you're going to do is kind of reverse the process, except you are going to launch the cables as opposed to how they were kind of coming out this way on the factory bike. We're going to send them forward just because there's a lot more room for this boot, and it's going to kind of sit right next to the seat latch plate, but it should be very kind of snug in there. And so start just by getting the connector through, and that's just going to go forward, and then once you've got it out, kind of feed the whole system forward, and kind of by eye you can look down and you'll see where the 4 studs are relative to the fender, or the pocket in the fender. And you'll see I'm slowly kind of jiggling the whole boot up, because it is going to be snug, and that is why we recommend using the boot there. But eventually the boot will kind of sit right there, and you can spin down one of the supplied lock nuts, and at that point you can go kind of take your hands off of it and get the rest of them ready to go. On here, before we go and put all the balance of them on and tighten them up, we do want to square away the wiring loom, because we've kind of taken a good foot of extra wire and we want to loop it in here, and we don't want to try to mess around going out here, but there is call it a mouse hole or a tunnel right above the key for removing the key latch to remove the seat. And so if you kind of get that 4-pin connector down under your subframe spar, you can kind of fish it back out on the other side and connect everything up, which should go this way. And at that point, that can stay, the connector can stay where it was, and you can make a service loop and kind of just tuck it down by the relay. And so it is not, I don't think you need to go crazy with zip tying things in here. You're welcome to if you want. At this point, you can get the balance of the lock nuts down and finish the process of installing the Fender Eliminator. And so the thing to note here is that you don't have to go super tight on the front mounts, because that is kind of like a big sandwich of plastic. And so you can certainly use a power driver. One thing to note though is that there's really no point in going super tight on those front bolts, because the rear is the one that has those steel spacers in it. So it's got full metal to metal bottom out, which means that's where all the load's going. And so these front ones are important, but they're not actually carrying the majority of the load path. And so these can be just kind of, yeah, you can see snug is a good way to put it. You still have a lot of locking retention from the conical lock washers, and then these ones are a wee bit tighter, but you should actually feel that kind of progression in tightness, meaning they're bottoming out. At that point, you do kind of want to make sure this isn't like somehow stuck or anything like that. Give the Fender Eliminator a good wiggle, make sure everything's kind of straight and true at the bottom, and then we can go ahead and put the seat on. So the finishing touches are get your seat back on, and use the 2 supplied rubber bumpers. They just slide in with a little bit of a snug fit. Those are going to keep your license plate from buzzing. Use the factory supplied hardware to put your license plate back on, and it's ready for a systems check. Alright, and with that, the installation process is complete. It'd be kind of a quick walk around view of how tight the license plate light is and the turn signals are to the body lines, but still providing some clearances. Certainly how kind of tucked in to the pocket in the underside of the motorcycle the Fender Eliminator is. And so it was good, obviously, to give it a quick systems check, make sure your license plate works, the license plate illumination is correct, and the turn signals work. Quick point of order here is this is set up to run either a United States or a Canadian plate. So if anything's longer than a 7-inch plate, like some of the European plates get really long, it won't work on this Fender Eliminator. It will get sucked into the tire. So we've done all the math for you guys, and we kind of made that compromise because we really like the way it looks, all kind of tucked under as it sits now with a US plate. And so apologies to the guys who have to run huge plates. This won't work. In any case, thank you guys for checking out this video. Our parts can be found at www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Thank you.